Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV Britain Edition. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Ruth Ware is considered by many to be the modern-day heir to Agatha Christie's mantle and handle as one of the best mystery writers around, with the Washington Post affirming that indeed Ware has been dubbed the new Agatha Christie. Not only do Ware's novels wink at Christie in a saucy way, but Ware herself is turning out to be as ingenious and indefatigable as the Queen of Crime. Entertainment Weekly has long been a fan of the signature feature that from the claustrophobic confines of a ship to the salty air of a beach, she spun her psychological crime thrillers in a myriad of settings. Exploding onto the scene less than a decade ago with her breakout hit in A Dark, Dark Wood, which became both a New York Times and London Sunday Times bestseller, with Reese Witherspoon quickly scooping up the film rights after reading this debut, where she cautioned, prepare to be scared, really scared. While her next smash hit, The Woman in Cabin 10, was snapped up for film adaptation just as quickly after Screen Rant reported the news that the second novel from author Ruth Ware, The Woman in Cabin 10, is a murder mystery thriller set aboard a luxury cruise ship, the Aurora Borealis. While The Lion Game grabbed Tinseltown headlines again when The Hollywood Reporter revealed recently that Entertainment One and the Gotham Group are developing a TV series based on the best-selling author's The Lion Game, with E1's president, Poncho Mansfield, celebrating the book as an edge-of-your-seat thriller that continues Ruth's cinematic storytelling with a swift pace and tension-raising style that makes it impossible to put down. The Death of Miss Westaway would inspire the New York Review of Books to quip that although it is possible that a better suspense novel may be published in 2018, it's not probable. The Death of Miss Westaway by Ruth Ware is a standard by which other suspense novels must be judged, and frankly it's doubtful any forthcoming books can approach, much less exceed that standard. USA Today would importantly note of a signature within her singular style on display in her next smash bestseller One by One, that as always, Ware is effective at not just manipulating her characters, but also their environment, with a simplicity that belies its effectiveness. Readers can picture themselves in a similar situation, and that adds to the suspense, while People magazine called it a claustrophobic spine tingler. National Public Radio would next declare that Ware creates suspense with sinister precision in The Turn of the Key, which contains all the most pleasurable hallmarks of the genre. A master sheet again put on display with another chart topper, which the Library Journal not surprisingly found to be another heart-pounding suspenseful thriller. Entertainment Weekly would rave of this instant bestseller that Ruth Ware is back with another edge-of-your-seat read. And she joins us today from the UK to talk about a remarkable career and rise to the top of the mystery game. Ruth, thank you so much for being here. Growing up in Britain, I imagine your first library was on wheels, and then with your mother working in the library system, it sounds like you were surrounded by books as a child.
I do remember the library van. They didn't come to my town because I lived in quite a, well, not a big town, but it was big enough to have its own library. But they came to my school, and if you were like the SWAT, which I was, let's be honest, your teacher would say you can choose the books for the class along with, like, two or three other kids. So you would get to go out of the classroom and climb up the steps of this like bookmobile and go in and choose what the rest of the class was going to be reading for like the next few weeks. Sorry, you can probably hear my cat in the background. This is the joy of Zoom. She'll probably jump up here in a minute. So yeah, so that was definitely a treasured childhood memory. But also my mum worked in the library services, which always made me feel a bit like I was coming home when I went into a library. The librarians quite often knew my name, and so I felt a little bit like library royalty, which was really fun. This is my cat who has just come to say hello.
And that's such an important connection to make when you're first young. Now, we understand you first began playing around with words on your own on your mother's typewriter when you were pretty young, 7 or 8 years old?
That was probably my first kind of introduction to typing. Was my mum, who she worked in the library services before my sister and I were born, and then she was a stay-at-home mum for a few years, and then she kind of decided that she needed to go back to school and get a few more qualifications. So she did a touch typing course and had this rather magical typewriter as part of it, and I used to sit there kind of pecking out little stories. I wrote a very bad play, among other things. Lots of little stories. But then my dad was an IT manager, so he was a really early adopter of kind of home computers. And so pretty early on, we had exactly what you were saying, like this sort of we had a thing called an apricot. I don't even know what that was. I can only assume it was like some early competitor to Apple that never quite took off. But yeah, we had an acorn, we had an apricot. And yeah, it was the green screen or the orange screen, and yeah, it was a completely different era now. I think I was always a storyteller. Even before I could write or type, I was, making up stories about my dolls and my teddies, and my poor sister got inflicted with this kind of really long running saga of, all of these sort of things in my imagination.
How old were you when you first expressed to your parents that you might want to follow into that profession?
I never really thought, I guess I always dreamed of being a writer, but I didn't really sort of dare to think that it could be a possibility. So, but I think I knew pretty early on that being a writer was a job, because I do remember having a conversation with my mum, and I can't have been more than probably about 5 or 6, and saying to her, she was like, so, what do you think you want to be? And I said, well, I think I'd like to be a writer. And she said, which is good advice, but maybe a little bit brutal for a 6-year-old. She said, well, I think that would be lovely, but I think you might find quite a lot of other people want to be a writer too. So maybe it would be a good idea to have a plan B in case the writing doesn't work out. And I said, okay, well, in that case, do you think that it's a job writing the blurbs on the back of books? And my mum said, yeah, definitely. Someone at the publisher has to do that. And I said, okay, well, if I can't be a writer, I think I'd like to write the blurbs on the back of books. Yeah, so that was the pinnacle of my 6-year-old ambition.
When you were attending secondary school and then studying English at the University of Manchester, were there any teachers or professors that made a particularly lasting impression on you as an influencer or a mentor? We hear about so many.
There was one teacher who, it would have been my second year at secondary school. So I would have been probably about 12 or 13. And for our summer assignment, she said, I want you to write a story, and you can make it, you can make it whatever you want. You can make it as long or as short or as, weird or whatever as you want. And of course, I was just like, oh, this is heaven. So I think I didn't, basically didn't go out for 6 weeks. I just sat there scribbling this very thinly veiled Ursula Le Guin ripoff, because that was what I was into at the time. And I think, my poor teacher, when I came back in September and handed her this sort of ring binder of handwritten A4 sheets, she must have just her heart must have sunk. But, she was very like, oh, this is great, but I don't think anyone ever really, I think I got the impression from teachers that I was good at creative writing. I do remember writing a story when I was about 8, and handing it into my teacher, and my teacher phoning my mum to say I don't think she wrote this. And my mum was like, yeah, she did, that's just what she's like. So I think at that point I thought, yeah, this is something that I'm okay at. But I can't say there was really a teacher who sort of made me feel like being a writer was within my grasp. In a way, it was always the reverse. I've always felt like I was being kind of steered into more sensible career options, which is, probably financially good advice. But people often ask, like, what should you study if you want to be a writer? Should you do a creative writing degree? Should you do an English degree? And I remember one of my teachers, I did classics at GCSE, so sort of Greek and Roman civilization. And I remember him quite strongly trying to dissuade me from doing English at university, which was what I ended up doing, because he said, you're a reader, you'll be a reader all your life, and you'll be a reader whether or not you do literature at university. So what you should study at university is something else. It's an opportunity to do something different that you don't already know about. And I didn't listen to him, because I love books, and I was good at English, and that was what I wanted to do. But I do think he had a point. But I think the thing about doing a literature degree was it made me read an awful lot of books that I wouldn't have read off my own volition. There's no way I would have sat down and read Chaucer or the Mort d'Arthur or studied Old English. And I can't say that any of that, on a conscious level goes through my head when I'm writing my novels today, because they obviously they don't. But I think the more, as a writer, reading is never a bad idea. Like, the more you read, the more you see how other people do things. I think all disciplines, you're standing on the shoulders of who went before you. And sometimes with things like science or mathematics, that's very obvious, because you can see the way people are building on the conventions and the work and the formulas of the people who came before them. And in literature, it's not as clear. But I think, the novel is a construct, and it was constructed by people who came before us. And the more you see that construct kind of coming into being, the more it's just interesting, and it makes you think about some of the conventions a bit harder.
And it sounds like you were learning so much by absorbing everything you were reading in the course of earning this degrees, and then out there writing on your own as you were first taking a shot at it.
I think all writers are kind of, I mean, I think there's even a line in a Dark Dark Wood where the main character, who's a mystery writer, says, writers are birds of carrion. They go out and they pick over the corpses of dead affairs and friendships, and also books. We're all, yes, you see snippets in other people's work and you try and figure out how they did it, and you think, could I incorporate something similar? Would I have done it differently? Would I have done it better? So yeah, absolutely. I seeing how other mystery writers have approached the genre, playing with that, changing it, modernizing it, expanding it, is a constant delight and a constant inspiration.
You first broke into the business writing YA books under Ruth Warburton, 5 in fact, beginning with A Witch Alone, then A Witch in Winter, A Witch in Love, Witchfinder, and Witch Hunt. What from that initial success helped you evolve your craft? And it must have been incredible encouragement to forge on book after book after you held that first one in your hand. It's such a special moment for so many authors we talk to.
I did write a lot of books before I wrote that one. There's that trope, I think it's Malcolm Gladwell or someone, who says that, to be good at something, you have to do it for 10,000 hours or something. I can't remember the figure. And I don't know if I wrote for 10,000 hours before I wrote in a Dark Dark Wood, but almost certainly wrote more than 1 million words, I think. I was writing throughout my teens and my 20s. Not a book a year, but probably a book-sized thing every couple of years. And I didn't do anything with it. They all went under the bed for good reason. They're staying there. People sometimes say, oh, do you think you'll ever revisit those books? And no, emphatically not. But, I can see, there's definitely elements that I return to. There's characters that I didn't want to let go of who reappear in later books in sort of slightly different ways. So I don't think anything's ever wasted. And then I actually wrote for teenagers for a few years. That was my first published book, was a YA book. And that was, I guess that would have been when I started writing it when I was about 30, 31. And then so I wrote 5 books for teenagers.
Your hometown papers would shower your first adult mystery book with major praises, ranging from the Independent labeling in A Dark Dark Wood this year's hottest crime novel, and The Guardian calling it mesmerizing, while Reese Witherspoon's endorsement definitely had to help, especially given Vox recently declared her the new high priestess of book clubs. Since her book club launched in 2017, it's become an industry phenomenon with the power to catapult titles to the top of the bestseller list. Her endorsement of yours is a book where readers should prepare to be scared, very scared. Sure had that impact too. Way before you frightened her and the millions of other readers who followed Nora, Claire, and Flo into the glass house and the escape room game the mystery is woven around, please take fans around the world of this massive breakout hit back inside its initial creation.
It was just having a conversation with a friend who's a huge thriller reader, and she knew that I loved them, and she was saying that she'd never read a thriller set on a hen night, and what a great setting it would be. And I sort of started racking my brains and thinking, there must be one. It's such a great setting. And I couldn't think of one. And as soon as she said it, I was like, ooh, okay, I think I want to write this book. And it was sort of, you probably had that feeling of when you have an idea that sort of starts to form itself. It's almost like watching a snowflake kind of form on, like you see the footage of it and it kind of little fronds start coming out and you can see the backbone of it, and then there's detail coming in. And it sort of felt like that. And on the bus on the way home, I was sort of thinking about it and thinking about the characters. Setting is hugely important to me, and setting often comes, if not first, at least very sort of high up in the order of what I think about in terms of the plot. Funny you should mention the kind of the old cottage, because that was my sort of first go-to thought in terms of, you're in a spooky wood, you want a sort of a spooky cottage, like sort of somewhere a bit rickety and old and tumble down. And that's how I started writing the book. But I often find that writing is a process of ignoring the first obvious thing that comes to you and going for something slightly more interesting and slightly more complicated than what you first thought of. And that was a prime example. And I did go for the first most obvious thing, and then I realized it wasn't right. And I realized that one of the big themes of that book is exposure, the fear of exposure, and the sort of the face that you present to the world and versus what's behind it. And the main character, Nora, is sort of pathologically shy. She's sort of retreated from the world. She doesn't want people to see her, quite literally. And so that house sort of sums up her ultimate nightmare, in that it's a glass house in the middle of a forest. It doesn't have any curtains because it's in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, the idea that people are outside looking in, that you can't protect yourself from their gaze, that you're under scrutiny, that you're in that kind of pressure cooker, all of that seemed to speak to the themes of the plot in a sort of more interesting way. But also, I think one of the inspirations, we talked a lot about literary inspirations, but one of the big inspirations for that book was the kind of the sort of Scream, Nightmare on Elm Street kind of classic sort of horror movies, and the sort of quintessential shot, which I think is particularly scary for British people because we don't live in those kinds of houses. There's always a moment where the main character is inside one of those big sort of suburban American houses with lots of windows, lots of patio doors, lots of exits and entrances, and they realize that the killer is out there, and they have to run around the house drawing the curtains and locking the doors and shut, and there's always one door that they can't quite get to. And so I just having a house with lots of entrances, lots of windows, where you couldn't shut the something outside away, that felt intrinsically more interesting to me. So that was how that house came about. And so I was about 3 chapters in, and then had to go back and rewrite all of the descriptions of the house. But as soon as I did, I was like, this is so much better. It's working so much better. Setting is hugely important to me, and setting often comes, if not first, at least very sort of high up in the order of what I think about in terms of the plot. Funny you should mention the kind of the old cottage, because that was my sort of first go-to thought in terms of, you're in a spooky wood, you want a sort of a spooky cottage, like sort of somewhere a bit rickety and old and tumble down. And I that's how I started writing the book. But I often find that writing is a process of ignoring the first obvious thing that comes to you and going for something slightly more interesting and slightly more complicated than what you first thought of. And that was a prime example. And I did go for the first most obvious thing, and then I realized it wasn't right. And I realized that one of the big themes of that book is exposure, the fear of exposure, and the sort of the face that you present to the world and versus what's behind it. And the main character, Nora, is sort of pathologically shy. She's sort of retreated from the world. She doesn't want people to see her, quite literally. And so that house sort of sums up her ultimate nightmare, in that it's a glass house in the middle of a forest. It doesn't have any curtains because it's in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, the idea that people are outside looking in, that you can't protect yourself from their gaze, that you're under scrutiny, that you're in that kind of pressure cooker, all of that seemed to speak to the themes of the plot in a sort of more interesting way. But also, I think one of the inspirations, we talked a lot about literary inspirations, but one of the big inspirations for that book was the kind of the sort of Scream, Nightmare on Elm Street kind of classic sort of horror movies, and the sort of quintessential shot, which I think is particularly scary for British people because we don't live in those kinds of houses. There's always a moment where the main character is inside one of those big sort of suburban American houses with lots of windows, lots of patio doors, lots of exits and entrances, and they realize that the killer is out there, and they have to run around the house drawing the curtains and locking the doors and shut, and there's always one door that they can't quite get to. And so I just having a house with lots of entrances, lots of windows where you couldn't shut the something outside away. That felt intrinsically more interesting to me. So that was how that house came about. And so I was about 3 chapters in, and then had to go back and rewrite all of the descriptions of the house. But as soon as I did, I was like, this is so much better. It's working so much better. And I wrote it pretty quickly. I think it would have been like sort of maybe 4 months or so, 4 or 5 months. Then obviously, went back and edited it a bit. No book is ever perfect first time round. But it did feel a bit like a sort of a gift from the blue, but it was very obviously not a YA book. There was no way that you could make a book about a hen night for teenagers. So I sort of had to reinvent myself as a crime novelist for adults.
Less than a year after its release, the New York Times would break the news in 2016 that British crime writer Ruth Ware has 2 bestsellers this week. Her new novel, The Woman in Cabin 10, enters the hardcover fiction list at number 4, while her debut remains number 8 on the trade paperback. And it's fair to say that between the success of the first and second books, you became an overnight household name around the world. You became an overnight household name internationally. When did you first decide you wanted to publish your second sensation upon the Aurora Borealis?
As you said, it was a follow-up to a book that had been pretty successful. Like, I think In a Dark Dark Wood certainly did a lot better than I had expected. I can't speak to anybody else, but I was writing the follow-up, and it was getting on the New York Times bestseller list, and Reese Witherspoon was like calling my agent and picking it up for film and stuff. And it should have been it was the most wonderful experience, but it made it very, very difficult to write. You're always worried about sort of second book syndrome. And there's so many books that everybody loves the first one, and then they're a bit kind of meh about the second one. And I think I just put a huge amount of pressure on myself to prove that I could write another book that was even more suspenseful and even more claustrophobic and had even more sort of interesting characters. And I literally threw everything at that book. There's sort of, the poor main character doesn't get a moment to breathe. There's like something happening on every single page. And I think that was a large part of it, because I was feeling under pressure to prove that I could pull it off again. But also, as the first book was coming out, I was getting these comparisons to Agatha Christie, which wasn't, although I'm a huge Christie fan, it wasn't something that had occurred to me as I was writing the book. I think, if you'd asked me what my influences were when I was writing, I think I would have said much more sort of horror movies and stuff like that. But the first person who made the comparison was my agent when I handed it in, and she said, "Oh, it's very like a modern Agatha Christie." And I think I sort of did a slight double take and was like, "I'm sorry, I don't see that," because my characters are very unlike Christie, the setting is very unlike Christie. But actually, the more I thought about it, the more I could see what she was saying, which is the kind of the structure of the mystery and the way it's revealed is pretty Christie-ish, as is the sort of the locked room conceit. And of course, when it came out, reviewers started making the same comparisons. And then with The Woman in Cabin 10, I really had the choice to pull away from that comparison or lean into it. And I think by that time, I'd sort of come to a realization about what an influence Christie had been on me and on my concept of what a perfect crime novel looked like in terms of structure and reveal and so on. And so I chose to lean into it very deliberately. And the thing that Christie does so well is that sort of sense of kind of stifled luxury. You've got settings like Death on the Nile, where they're on a dahabeah on the Nile, or Murder on the Orient Express, where they're on this kind of super luxe train, and then There Were None, where they're in this kind of exclusive private island. And then of course she turns it into a complete nightmare, because a prison that you can't escape from is still a prison, even if it's a super luxe one. So I decided that I wanted to lean into that comparison, to write a book with a similar feel. And so that was, the decision to set it on a cruise was very much the kind of going the Christie route of a super luxurious gilded prison. I always feel like if I'm writing an argument, I very often go downstairs in a state of heightened pissed offness and have to remind myself that I wasn't actually arguing with my family, that they're completely blameless. I think as a writer, you always experience the emotions that your characters are experiencing. But at the same time, writing, I find anyway, is pretty much like free therapy, like working through an emotion, feeling it in an unreal way, and as is the case with most crime books, having some sort of resolution at the end, some sort of reassuring message. That's actually I find it's pretty cathartic and pretty good, to work with. So when I finished that book, I was probably less anxious than when I began it.
Could you give fans and viewers a sense of how you create that one of claustrophobia and of fear right around the turn so convincingly on the page?
I don't really know what my process is, apart from the fact that it is a personal nightmare of mine. Like, I wouldn't say I'm not claustrophobic in the sense of like I can get in a lift, that's fine, it doesn't bother me. But I think being in situations that I can't get away from is something I find really stressful, particularly socially. If I'm at a party, the person who's giving me my lift has disappeared upstairs, I don't know when I'm going to be able to leave, I don't know anyone here. That's pretty much my kind of, other people have anxiety dreams about turning up to school without having done revision for their exams or with no clothes on or whatever. That doesn't bother me, but the idea of being like trapped at a party when I don't know where I'm going to be able to leave, that is my personal nightmare. And that's basically Lo's extended situation in that book, is that she's on she's in a situation where she has to perform because she's a press officer, well, she's a journalist on a press cruise, so she's out to impress. She wants to try and get this assignment done, she wants to get promoted when she gets back, so she has to do a really good job. She can't get away because obviously the ship isn't going to dock anywhere, and she's suffering more and more from anxiety. She's had this horrible break-in at the beginning of the book, so she's already in a state of kind of heightened anxiety about everything. So she's not sleeping, and she's maybe drinking a little bit too much, as some of us do when we're under pressure. I always feel like if I'm writing an argument, I very often go downstairs in a state of heightened pissed offness and have to remind myself that I wasn't actually arguing with my family, that they're completely blameless. I think as a writer, you always experience the emotions that your characters are experiencing. But at the same time, writing, I find anyway, is pretty much like free therapy, like working through an emotion, feeling it in an unreal way, and as is the case with most crime books, having some sort of resolution at the end, some sort of reassuring message. That's actually I find it's pretty cathartic and pretty good, to work with. So when I finished that book, I was probably less anxious than when I began it.
Speaking of Laura Lowe Blacklock and the other passengers she's trapped with on the cruise ship, who are any of your favorite among the crew or the other travelers? And were any modeled on classic character archetypes from the Christie era?
In fact, the name of the main character, Lowe Blacklock, is a tip to Christie. There's a Christie character called Blacklock. So yeah, that was a thank you to her.
Now that catchy, perfect title is such a key to tying a book together as a finishing and ironically beginning in touch for the reader toward intriguing them to pick it up in the first place. Did you have this one early on?
So that was a tough thing to find, actually. Titles either tend to be so right that everybody agrees, or else they're just a huge tussle. So my original title when I started working on the book was The Girl in Cabin 10, and as I was writing, this little known author, Paula Hawkins, who you may have heard of, brought out another book with girl in the title. And I just started to think it's too close. Some of the themes were even quite similar. And I thought, I can't use this title. So I handed the book in under the name of Cruise Book, which was very pithy, and said to my editors, really sorry, this is the title I wanted to use, but obviously we can't go for it. And they were both like, yeah, obviously we can't go for it, that would be a terrible idea. And so we batted titles back and forth for, I think literally weeks. And it was like things about the sea, things about the boat, things about whatever you could imagine. None of them were quite right. And I think it might have been my agent who said, what if we called it The Woman in Cabin 10? And at the time, there really weren't any woman books out there. And I think everybody did a kind of the woman, like sort of, does that sound really weird? And I sort of started off thinking that's really strange. And then I was like, well, no, actually, these people are women. They're not girls. This is why aren't we? We wouldn't have the boy if it was like a book about a man. And the more I sort of said it aloud in my head, the more I was like, the woman in cabin 10, the woman in cabin 10. It just suddenly realized that was the title. And yeah, fortunately, that was different enough that we all felt comfortable going with it.
Taking your fans inside the hurricane of success that followed, when you're standing in the eye of it all, so to speak, watching it go on around you, how much of a distraction can that be, or maybe a motivation to stay focused, as at the same time you were heading into the writing of your next bestseller, The Lion Game?
I mean, it was amazing. I really, really felt the pressure when I was writing The Women in Cabin 10. That was the book where I was sort of sweating about it. Weirdly, by the time The Lion Game came around, I felt okay about it, which I should have felt more stressed because, as you point out, The Woman in Cabin 10 was another step above what we'd all achieved within A Dark Dark Wood. So it should have felt like more pressure, but I think I felt like I'd proved that In a Dark Dark Wood wasn't a flash in the pan. I proved that I could write another book that was, not just as good, but arguably better. And so I sort of felt like I'd proved a lot of things to myself, if not to anybody else. And with The Lion Game, I kind of let myself off the hook a little bit and sort of, it's a much more contemplative book. I wouldn't say it's a quieter book exactly, but it's definitely, I definitely wasn't sort of throwing things at the plot the way I was with The Woman in Cabin 10. I think I just sort of thought, fair play. I've hit 2 home runs. I can sit back and be proud of myself for a little bit.
Another Reese Witherspoon book club pick of 2017. The Hollywood Reporter would break the news of The Lion Game's film adaptation by E1 and the Gotham Group following its hitting the bestseller list, with Gotham CEO Ellen Goldsmith-Vane telling The Hollywood Reporter at the time that Ruth is a master storyteller. Everything she writes feels so cinematic, and the characters are so rich. When you sat down to begin work on this third book, were you feeling a little more relaxed as you typed away?
It was crazy, and it was I think that the thing is that translations always come out quite a long time after, just because of the mechanics of publishing. So In a Dark Dark Wood was sort of taking off in the United States and the UK in 2016, but a lot of the real kind of overseas madness didn't really hit until like a year or two down the line. So I think the peak sort of pressure in terms of traveling and touring and stuff didn't really hit home until kind of, The Lion Game / Death of Mrs. Westaway. And that was when I was sort of like, I was doing like 2-3 trips a month, and like my kids were like, when are you coming home? It took a while for it to sort of sink in.
The Death of Miss Westaway would inspire the New York Review of Books to quip that although it's possible that a better suspense novel may be published in 2018, it's not probable. Ruth Ware's latest book is the standard by which other suspense novels must be judged, and frankly, it's doubtful any forthcoming book can approach, much less exceed that standard. When you were first slipping into the skin of a tarot card reader like Harriet Howe Westaway to pull off what could be called the con of a lifetime among fellow grifters, did you seek out any real fortune tellers as sources?
It was sort of a roundabout way I came to it, because having written 3 books about sort of people, regular nice women who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time and a bad thing happened to them, I decided that I wanted to do something a bit different with book 4, and I decided I wanted to write about a character who sets the crime in train themselves by committing it. And so when I started out, I was like, I'm going to write the talented Mr. Ripley, but it's going to be a girl. Obviously, I did not do that. I love Patricia Highsmith, and like I was never going to write anything as classic as her. But I decided that I wanted to write a book about a woman or a girl, because Hal is actually, she's very young in the book. She's sort of barely kind of 20. Someone who sets out to commit a crime, and the crime that she sets out to commit is an inheritance crime. I didn't think I could write a mass murderer. I'm not into sort of serial killers and stuff. So it was always going to be a fairly bloodless crime, but basically she sets out to defraud this innocent family of their inheritance. And so I sort of set up the beginning where she gets a letter out of the blue, and she's got a fairly unusual name, Hal Westaway, which is an important part of the plot. And she realizes that one of these kind of heir hunter firms has tracked down the person who should have received the legacy, and it's not her. Like, it's been sent to her in error. Her grandmother died years ago. She doesn't know the person in the letter, but she decides to claim the inheritance anyway. And as soon as I started to write it, I realized I needed to give her a set of skills that would make her feel she could carry this deception off, because it's a pretty big, it's a big ask to say, walk into a stranger's house, pretend to be their long lost granddaughter, defraud them of, several £1 million. And I thought, who would do that? It would have to be someone with a background in reading people, deceiving people, playing people. And I decided that I was going to make her something in the kind of medium, sort of fake medium sort of line, someone who would be very good at cold reading other people, seeing their reactions, drawing facts out of them without them even realizing it. But a fake medium just seemed a little bit too harsh, and I don't know why it didn't stick as an idea. And then I thought, I'll make her a tarot reader. And I didn't know anything about tarot when I started to write the book. So I had to basically teach myself tarot in order to be able to write it, which was great fun. And I started out, I think, fairly cynically, really. I read a Derren Brown book. I don't know how popular he is in the States, but he's this magician slash kind of mind reader slash sort of cold reader who shows you how it's done, and he shares all of his techniques. And he wrote this brilliant book that explains how fake mediums and fake psychics pull all of their tricks. And so I read that. But the more tarot I read, the more I kind of fell in love with it as an art form. And I'm not superstitious. I don't really believe anybody has psychic powers. And I certainly don't believe tarot readers do. But I do think that they're an extraordinarily useful kind of psychological tool, really. When you do a reading, what you're really doing is asking a series of questions, and then you are looking at a series of possibilities and seeing how those possibilities make you feel, how you react to them, which is useful. It's a useful tool to do on yourself, and I do sometimes do cold readings for myself still, even though the book was several years ago. So then she became a tarot reader, but I decided I would write the book before speaking to any tarot readers, partly because I knew I was going to make her a cynical fake. So not just that she's faking it, but she knows she's faking it, and she does it quite deliberately for money. And I thought that actual tarot readers might be a bit pissed off about that, so I thought I wouldn't go there. But I did, when I'd finished writing the book and I was sort of in the editing phase, I did go for a tarot reading in Brighton, which is where the book begins. And it was fascinating, having done all the research beforehand. It was really interesting to see how the tarot reader did it, the kinds of questions he was asking, how much I agreed with his reading, what I would have pulled out. So I was glad that I'd done it that way around. And actually, most of the tarot readers I've encountered on Twitter have been really very nice about the book. So I did sort of put it out there slightly trepidatiously, thinking, please don't think I'm being rude about your profession. But I think, a surprising number of tarot readers are like Hal, not in the sense that they're cynical, but in the sense that they find the cards beautiful and a really useful way of trying to understand themselves and other people.
We spoke earlier on the brilliant ways you use modern technology to help tell your stories, and The Turn of the Key is no exception with the way you utilize the smart house that Rowan Kane nannies in, while still employing the traditional psychological thriller elements of a classic like Henry James' The Turn of the Screw. What did you have the best time with as you wove what NPR found were all the most pleasurable parts of the genre while weaving this mystery masterpiece?
So the whole book is an epistolary novel, which is not a form that is much used anymore, but it was great fun to write. For anyone who hasn't read The Turn of the Key, the premise is that it's a nanny who's in prison for the death of a child in her care at the beginning of the book, and she's writing to a lawyer, basically trying to persuade him to take her on. One of the big genocide for that book was reading lots of articles which were in the press at the time about this new phenomenon of digital abuse. And it's something that people have never really had to encounter until now, but of course our technological lives now get tangled up almost as much as our financial ones. So when you break up with somebody, it's a process of not just, dividing up your books and your CDs and the bank account, but also of disentangling your digital footprint. And, that can just mean unfriending them on Facebook, but it can be more insidious in terms of things like, if you're the person who gets to stay in the marital home, but your partner is the person who set up the security cameras and he doesn't hand over the passwords, that can be a very difficult situation. And I think the first prosecution in the UK, I think, was about 2015, 2016. And it was for someone who had been listening into their estranged partner via their home hub and stalking them using the information that they'd gained. So they'd been able to log in, listen to their conversations, and figure out where they were going to be. And so that, being a crime writer, I sort of ended up playing with it a bit more and twisting it a bit more. But it's the idea of being in a house where you don't control the technology, and where someone could be listening to you and could be watching you and could be playing with you a little bit. I guess it's, again, like, I'm the kind of person who, I don't actually have a cover for my laptop camera, but I do occasionally think about it. I don't have an Alexa because I don't like the idea of someone listening into all my conversations. So I think it comes back to that thing of mining what makes you uncomfortable, and the kind of technological encroachments on our lives, the idea that you're handing over the keys to some quite personal parts of your life over to an app or a technology or a home hub. All of that makes me feel quite uneasy, and I think that's what makes it good copy for a book, to kind of mine those anxieties, because I don't think I'm the only person who has that sort of slightly ambivalent relationship with my technology.
You open one by one in a way that many had never seen a mystery open before, announcing to the reader ahead of time in a BBC story that an avalanche at a remote mountain ski resort in the French Alps, where you based the story, had killed 6 of the main characters. A debut the Washington Post praised as ingenious. Why did you feel like that was the right way to begin this book, giving the reader such a key clue to how the story advances right from the start?
It was there right from the beginning, and the reason was because I knew that I would have a really big cast in that book. And so I knew that there was going to be a lot of groundwork in terms of introducing people, setting up the setting, setting up the story. And I guess, as I'm a crime writer, and so you want to let the readers know, don't worry, there's like, crime is going to happen, bad stuff is going to happen, people are going to get murdered. So it was a not very subtle way to say to them, hang in there, because stuff is going to hit the fan, and here's how many people are going to be murdered. And I think the tension in those early scenes comes from the knowledge that only a certain number of them are going to make it out alive. And as you sort of like or dislike some of them, I hope the reader is trying to figure out who might be picked off and how much they will care about that, and how much they think that person deserves to not make it to the end of the book. So that was there right from the beginning, as a way of making the reader connect with those characters in a slightly different way. Obviously, like, the book has a really strong technology theme, and I think part of that was a hangover from the Turn of the Key, and that you're always, or I find I'm always kind of writing back against the book that I just wrote. I'm sort of answering it in a way. So having written a book about someone who was at the mercy of tech, I sort of wanted to write a book about the other side of tech, where what happens if you're the person exploiting other people. So there's a company in the book who are a tech company, and I knew that I wanted to write a book about colleagues, because I'd written a lot about families and romantic relationships and friendships, but I hadn't written much about colleagues. And back in the days when we were all in the office, that's a pretty key part of our life for most of us. Is the person that we work with. They can make us very happy or very, very miserable, and both of those are, it can be a very toxic relationship if you've got a bad boss. So I knew that I wanted to address all of that, but the skiing specifically came from my way back to In a Dark, Dark Wood. I made the main character, Nora, a runner. And for years afterwards, I got these lovely notes from people who were also runners saying, oh, I can tell you're a runner. You write so well about running. And the truth is, I'm not a runner. I don't even run for the bus if I can possibly help it. So I kept having to write back and say, I'm so sorry, I actually am not a runner. I just have a good imagination. My partner runs a bit, so I sort of, I have some insight into it, but yeah, I don't. And it made me feel really guilty. So this time I thought, right, I'm going to set a book around a sport, but the only sport that I do and enjoy is skiing. So I'd wanted to write a book in a ski resort, and of course, snow for a mystery writer is just so useful. You can have footsteps, you can be tracked, you can be trapped, you can have avalanches. Obviously I was going to put them at the top of a funicular, because why not? That's just the worst place to be. It's a brilliant setting that immediately gets your imagination ticking, and as you said, had so many possibilities that you could just sort of reach out and think, I'll take that, I'll take that, I'll take that.
Curiously, you also don't write super graphic murder scenes as they happen throughout the story. Why do you feel the less is more approach works well for you in this aspect of your novel writing? And any advice along those lines for the aspiring author?
One by One, in some ways, is one of my bloodiest books because it has a pretty high body count. Many of my books have 1 to no murders at all, whereas One by One, it tells you right at the beginning, there's a newspaper clipping that tells you how many people die, so that it's going to be a fairly high body count. But it's true that most of those murders do take place kind of off camera, and I think that's because for me, I liken it to like a crime being a bit like a pebble thrown into a pond, and the pebble is the crime, but what I'm more interested in is the ripples and the aftermath and the effect on the people surrounding the crime. And I think in One by One, that's really what I'm going for. It's exploring not just the act, but what happens to the people in the aftermath of that act, and who are forced to sort of be in the vicinity of that act.
Entertainment Weekly would rave of your newest instant bestseller, that Ruth Ware is back with another edge-of-your-seat thriller with The It Girl, which casts Oxford University as a setting character and tells the narrative story from the point of view of 2 characters set in 2 different points in times. Say taking those of Hannah and Will or of their friends. Could you take us behind the scenes on a little bit of a technical tour of how that works for you as you're writing?
Just to explain, for obviously, I don't know when this is going out, but most people probably won't have read The It Girl. So The It Girl is a 2 timeline book, and it starts, the first chapter is a before chapter where my character is at Oxford University and discovers the murder of her roommate, the body of her roommate in their dorms. And then it flashes to after, which is 10 years later, where my character's living in Edinburgh. She's working as a bookseller. She's pregnant with her husband. And the man who was convicted of her friend's killing has just died in prison. And it should be a moment of catharsis for her, where she's sort of able to move on, think that chapter is closed, focus on the new life inside her. But it's not. And the book kind of unpicks why it isn't, and how much that fact has been bothering her for the last sort of 10 years. So it was a fun book to write. I always like writing books with 2 separate sections, because if you get bored of one, you can just flip and move to the other. I always write 99.5% as you read it. Like I don't write in 2 sections separate sort of chunks. If I've got 2 narrators, as I did in One by One, I write it as you read it, swapping back and forth and back and forth. Partly because, as I was just saying, if you get bored with the section, I want to switch as a writer along with the reader. Partly because I think as a crime writer particularly, it's really important to keep in mind what your reader knows, what they're thinking, how much information you've already given them, what you want them to be thinking versus what they might have figured out. And for me, the only way I can do that is to write in sync with what my reader will be experiencing. If I tried to do it out of order, I think I would just get hopelessly confused. So no, I write it pretty much as you read the book. I find things out in the order that you read them in the book. I don't really outline. I have sort of outlined some of my books to an extent, but very kind of loosely. But what I do always know, and I knew with this book, is who did it and how they did it, like what the method is. In this book, why took a little bit longer to pin down, but I knew that from pretty early on as well. And I think that's important for me, because partly it gives me something to write for, but partly I think as a crime writer I always want to give the reader a fair chance at guessing the solution of the mystery, and the only way I can do that is to sort of feed them the clues and the little bits of information. So if I don't know the solution to the mystery, I can't, drop little breadcrumbs for the reader to hint to it. And my ideal is always that when the when the solution is revealed, which they might have guessed, hopefully they might not, but you can never fool all of the readers all of the time. Hopefully the reaction should be, of course. I don't want people to feel blindsided. I want them to feel like, oh, I should have guessed that, she gave me every chance and I didn't see it, kind of thing.
In 2022, the Today Show and Fortune magazine ranked yours as among the most anticipated book of the year's new high-profile releases, while Parade hailed your ability in and out to deliver a masterfully built mystery. As you watch your words travel out of your imagination and into those of your readers, especially those who've made you their Agatha Christie, that must be quite a ride to be on right now.
It's amazing. Like, it's continuously a source of delighted bewilderment to me, that I'm getting emails from places that I've never even visited. My books are really big in Iran, which is like a real trip, because obviously, Iran is under sanctions, publishers aren't allowed to deal with them, but somebody over there has just found my book and translated it, so like, whatever, it's very nice that they can enjoy it, I guess. Just places that I would never have expected to go. My books are traveling and meeting people and making fans, which is just, it's truly incredible. And it's fantastic. My books aren't really for kids, like, there's quite a lot of swearing, there's drugs, there's a modicum of violence, but yeah, for sure, like, I have a lot of teenage readers, and that is lovely as well, to see like kids who've been reading me since they were like sort of 13, 14, writing to me like 5 years on saying, oh, I'm so excited, you were the first like adult book that I read, and this is really, I'm excited for your new one. Like, that's just incredible. But I guess from the point of view of writing, for me anyway, writing is a sort of, the process of writing a book for me is always like creating an elaborate fiction that nobody is going to read this. So I think Stephen King puts it beautifully, where he says, you write the first draft with the door closed, and then you write the second draft with the door open. And the only way I can persuade myself to have the freedom to make mistakes, to try things, to experiment, to possibly fail, is to pretend to myself that this book isn't going to be read by anyone but me. So when I'm writing, I don't let anybody read it. I don't send it to my agent or my editors for feedback until right at the end. And each editorial iteration is a sort of a part of the process of, now I'm going to send it to my agent, now I'm going to send it to my editor, well, now my editor likes it, maybe it can go out to sales, and sort of persuading myself that it's okay, that it's going to, that more people will read it. So I guess it's something that I try not to think about too much when I'm writing, because it would probably just give me such enormous stage fright.
In that same spirit, what's waiting in the wings, so to speak, that your readers can look forward to getting their hands on next?
I am writing something right now. It's at slightly too much of an ugly duckling stage to talk about, but it doesn't have a title, is the other thing. But I think it's going to be about a pen tester, which is a term nobody's ever heard of apart from people in the security industry. So I'm going to have to find a better way of explaining this book. But it's basically someone who works in the security industry. And pen testers are people who break into buildings or hack into systems for a living as a way of testing the system. So they basically go back to companies and say, like, here's what held up, here's what you need to do better. So the kind of white hat hackers in a way. So yeah, it's been really fun to research, really fun to write. But I'm slightly at the stage where it's kind of like, oh, am I going to be able to pull this off?
Beyond that, where do your creative ambitions lie looking out into the future?
All writers have their kind of, their Moby Dick project that they would love to get to one day. I've got about half a dozen, but the thing that I think of as my retirement book, the book that I'm going to write when I'm sort of 60 or 70, I would love to write like Mad Men, but for the publishing industry, like something, because the changes that the industry has been through in the last 30, 40, 50 years is just incredible, from sort of like clever young men in back rooms in Bloomsbury to these like global conglomerates that we have today who are just, taking over the world. Yeah, I would love to write that novel, but that's one for the future. Nobody write it in the meantime. I will sue you.
When you're directing writers toward the same horizons, no matter what age they begin having that same dream you did when you first began your climb to the top of the bestsellers list, what do you say to encourage them forward down their own path?
I mean, if there was a magic formula, obviously I would bottle that and make my fortune off selling it. So I think, that's one thing that I always try and say, is that there's no shortcuts. Like, you have to read a lot, you have to write a lot. I reassure them that the first book that I wrote was most definitely not the first book that I published, and that's fine. I think kids feel under a lot of pressure, to write a book aged 17 or 18 and get it onto the shelves of their local bookstore. And obviously, like, that's amazing if it happens, but it doesn't have to be like that. One of the great things about being a writer is that there's no sell by date. Like, you can carry on. It's not like being a footballer or a ballerina or something. I do hope that I will be writing into my 70s. So, keep trying, keep reading, keep writing, and give yourself permission to fail. I think that's what stopped me from publishing or trying to publish for many years, was that I was frightened of failing, and now I wish I'd been a bit braver and a bit more willing to trip up.
Finally, in closing, it must be a whole different dimension of cool to see your imagination being adapted into all these different film and TV projects. Whether we're talking about Reese Witherspoon's involvement again in A Dark, Dark Wood and The Woman in Cabin 10, or more recently with Turn of the Key, which Deadline reported was set to be adapted for the big screen, with a script written by Spiral star Max Mingla and Rocket Man's Jamie Bell. Or other titles that might be in negotiation right now you could dish on for your fans?
It would probably either have to be In a Dark, Dark Wood, just because that's my baby. It was my first book, and there's some really amazing people attached to that project, and I could just imagine so many actresses playing that group of friends and doing it brilliantly. I think women often aren't given the really kind of toxic parts to play, and that's always fun to see on screen. But the other one that I would love to see on screen is probably The It Girl, just because it's my most recent, and I think there's not that many campus novels out there. There should be more. So yeah, I would love to see like the quads of Oxford and all of that on screen. And I feel like the author is always like the one going, what's going on? And I realize the more my books get optioned, the more I realize how little I know about the Hollywood and TV process, and how absolutely barking it seems as a system to anybody outside of it. Like, it's just so chaotic and complicated. But no, most of my books are either currently under option or have had the rights bought. They're all like at various different stages, but I've no idea which one will get over the finish line first. If any, I just sort of get these cryptic updates about treatments and development plans and stuff, and I'm like, I have no idea what this means, but it all sounds great.
Ruth, it has been just wonderful talking with you today. Congratulations on all your success, and thank you so much for taking our time to be on About the Authors TV.
It's been awesome. I've loved the questions. Yeah, and please say hi to your wife again.